Hi everyone, here's the Bookchemist once again. Sorry about the video, it's going to be a bit dark probably, it's very rainy today. And thank you so much for all your comments to the second part of my reading project on Gravity's Rainbow. I'm really enjoying this reread of the novel, especially I enjoy a lot discussing it with you, getting all this feedback, getting all these different interpretations of the novel. One of the most interesting discussions going on in the comments in the last 2 weeks was an exchange between two commenters called Vince and Ivan Waller. Those two guys discussed the idea of Slothrop as the protagonist of Gravity's Rainbow. You know, many of you commented on the fact that if they didn't know better, they'd probably think that Roger, Mexico, or maybe even Jessica, or even Pirate Prentice, I would say, are actually the protagonists of the novel rather than Slothrop. Now, knowing, having read the novel, knowing about the second half, even though I remember very little about the plot and the characters' development from that second half of the novel, I can confirm that Slothrop plays a much more important part in that second part of Gravity's Rainbow. But at the same time, I do agree with you, but also I agreed very much with the comment by Vince, 1979, who said that probably, possibly, this idea that Slothrop is perceived as the main character of the novel, but maybe isn't, not necessarily, may be related to the idea that Slothrop himself, being paranoid, and in the part we read these last 2 weeks, in part 2 of the novel, Au Permo Casino Hermann Göring, Slothrop's paranoia really kicks in. Being so paranoid, he believes he is the main character of a certain conspiracy, that everyone is in on this conspiracy, everyone wants to do something horrible to him. But maybe he is not even the main character of Gravity's Rainbow, not really. He just believes he is, because that's part of his delusions. But at the same time, Ivan Waller, by the way, at first I agreed with Vince 100%, I love that interpretation, but I also have to agree with Ivan, who said that actually though, as we already saw in this part of the novel, in the part we read in these last 2 weeks, well, the conspiracy against Slothrop is real. Slothrop is actually correct in thinking that people want to harm him, or anyway that they are interested in him. It's very difficult to discuss this without spoiling anything from later into the novel, and I'm not going to do that, of course, but I believe that that ambivalency is part of the beautiful way Gravity's Rainbow reflects on conspiracies and on alternate histories, alternate views of history. It reflects on that idea, which is expressed most notably in one of the most often quoted lines from the novel, which we read in this part, in part 2. The second, I think it's the second proverb for paranoids, you know, if they can get you to ask the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about the answers. In my opinion, the way I read Gravity's Rainbow, the text is critical, of course, of narratives given by groups in power, given by people in the military-industrial complex, in the government, in corporations, but at the same time it is also maybe skeptical of straight-up conspiracy theories, because what those ones do is simply substitute a grand narrative from a different grand narrative that explains everything away. In my opinion, that is clear in Gravity's Rainbow. It's much clearer in Bleeding Edge, which is a book that focuses extensively on 9/11. And in Bleeding Edge, the way I read it, conspiracy theories that read 9/11 as an inside job are shown as every bit as absurd and every bit as believable as grand narratives that, you know, portray an official reading of 9/11, what the book calls the journal of records, the newspaper of records reading of the event. And the meaning of that ambivalence and the idea that many people find distasteful in Bleeding Edge, the idea that the text doesn't really care whose fault 9/11 actually was, is that focusing on that misses the point. It misses the consequences of the act, the deep causes of it, the reasons why it happened, what we should do in light of the event. And I believe that Gravity's Rainbow does a similar difficult but relevant and crucial type of reflection. I feel this is getting very convoluted, so going back to the novel, yeah, I do believe that Slothrop's nature as the narrative's main character mirrors very beautifully its nature as the protagonist of his own conspiracy theories and his own paranoia paranoid delusions, which are maybe not delusions at all, actually. Actually, no, they aren't. Are they? Yeah. Anyway, one thing I asked you in the last video, and lots of you replied to that question. I asked you whether the way the text keeps talking to the reader, keeps referring, keeps using the second person, keeps talking to you, whether you thought that that broke the narrative immersion into the events, or whether it helped it, fostered it, it made you feel like you were inhabiting a sort of, maybe even a virtual experience, maybe even a sort of video game. And most of you interpreted the second person as neither. Most of you, and I can very much agree, find the second person as a way for the narrator to help you step into the mind of the characters. When the text uses the second person, it's almost as if you're listening to characters talking to themselves. As such, you have an access to their deep reasonings, to maybe their deepest fears, maybe their most convoluted, even paranoid beliefs or suspicions. And I can absolutely agree, I can absolutely relate. When it comes to the part itself, when it comes to the actual reading experience, to Opperm or Casino Hermann Göring, I like this part a lot. The scene with the octopus is one of my favorite in the book, the general scene on the beach. Very fun. Love the song about Englishmen, the difference between Englishmen and Americans when it comes to getting girls. I do believe that in this part, for me at least, so-called Pynchon fatigue started kicking in. This section, this part 2, features possibly the most disturbing scene in the novel for me, which is of course the one with Katie and General Pudding, but also all that long section about Slothrop's paranoia, Slothrop's descent into his paranoia. I find that very difficult to read and very difficult to focus on. The text gets really challenging, and even very interesting parts in that section. For instance, the part about the Argentinian anarchists and their idea on what to do with Germany after the war, the possibilities of this lawless zone outside control. That's very interesting stuff, but since it's narrated through the focalization of Slothrop, who is prey to his paranoid delusions, the text is very challenging and very difficult and extremely dense. What about you? Is your brain feeling the burn? Are you alright? Is it still a breeze? Let me know, of course, in the comments. And I'm very curious about the section we're going to read in the next 2 weeks. And as always, as with all of these videos, in the description box you find the reading schedule for this reading project. Mostly I'm curious because I remember very little about part 3, and I remember very vividly a few characters who still have not appeared in the novel. I remember them as coming in much earlier, so I'm curious about that too, and we'll see. When it comes to this part, one of the things I loved, and yet again one of the things that I missed upon my first read of my first reading experience with Gravity's Rainbow, is the way Slothrop's paranoia, to me, also feels like a way of discussing PTSD's, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is of course the consequences of Slothrop's immersion in the war, Slothrop's time in London, where V1s and V2 missiles and rockets could fall at any time, the fact that he is basically having a very big nervous breakdown. And that now that he is away from the war, now that he is in peaceful France, actually he misses the war in a way, which is a key concept in post-traumatic stress disorder, this very specific type of trauma. And remember, trauma, PTSD didn't exist in World War II, or at least wasn't really thought about the way we think about it now. I'm far from an expert on these sorts of things, even though trauma studies in literary studies are very popular these days, are a very successful recent development in literary studies. There's lots of interesting studies about it. If you want to read a text on the topic, read Alan Gibb's Contemporary American Trauma Narratives. If you don't know what trauma is, just Google the cover of that book, Contemporary American Trauma Narratives, and you will experience trauma firsthand. What I wanted to say is that I'm not an expert, but I believe that this type of traumatic experience, PTSD, was starting to be recognized and to be diagnosed actually at the time Gravity's Rainbow was being written, at the time of the Vietnam War, but still take this with a pinch of salt. I do believe, though, that Gravity's Rainbow wanted to be a contribution on that front too, and wanted to be a reflection on that specific type of trauma, of war fatigue. This part also features some very beautiful reflections, as the rest of the book does, either nested in the character's stream of thoughts, or, as the one I'm talking about now, nested in dialogues. I loved this one where Slothrop and Tantivy, or is it Tantivy, I'm not sure, these two guys describe the dynamics of power. And again, as mentioned before, Gravity's Rainbow, in my opinion, really wants you to focus on the narratives of power, on the way power structures itself and perpetrates control. The part where they reflect on the university, places like Oxford, places like Harvard, as places where power goes to, once again, reproduce itself, places where the ruling classes basically kind of divide and conquer the world and structure the future, places where the educational side of the university is almost a secondary element, it's almost an irrelevant thing, and it's a very powerful image, and there's lots to be appreciated in that idea. It makes you question maybe some assumptions you have about certain structures of power, like the university, and it's beautiful. That reflection, by the way, is to be found on page 230 in the vintage 2013 edition of the book. I'm going to quote a few passages, and you'll find the passages in the description box. You'll have to do your math if you have a different edition, unfortunately. Shouldn't be too difficult, though. This part also features the only instance that I could find using a basic word processor, the only instance of the word rainbow capitalized. It's on page 249 of my edition, and it goes like this. Slothrop and Katia are together, they are talking about the world, and the text goes. This is a beautiful paragraph, bear with me. But it is a curve each of them feels, unmistakably. It is the parabola. They must have guessed, once or twice, guessed and refused to believe, that everything always collectively had been moving toward that purified shape latent in the sky, that shape of no surprise, no second chances, no return. Yet they do move forever under it, reserved for its own black and white bad news, certainly as if it were the rainbow, and they its children. To me, this represents, in lyrical terms, in beautiful terms, this is an amazingly written paragraph. It represents one of the most basic but most crucial reflections of Gravity's Rainbow. That idea that, remember, this text was written in the late 60s, early 70s, deep Cold War. That idea that the type of destruction that was going on in London during World War II, this idea that at any moment a missile could fall on your head and destroy you forever, is the same world. Basically all of the world has become London, with the Cold War, with the arms race, this idea of the ominous nature of contemporary life. And of course the book offers you this very bleak view on the world and on history, but at the same time maybe questions whether there can be some escapes from this stalemate, from this horrible, horrifying situation. And the book, through its freedom, through its counter-narratives, through its crazier characters, offers maybe a few escapes. But we'll discuss this in later videos, because I remember at least, that the book goes much more, discusses these ideas much more in depth later. In the first two videos in this project, I've talked extensively about Gravity's Rainbow's reflections on science, on the divide between the two kinds of knowledge in today's world, science and the humanities, what is lost in the distance, in this divide. And I keep talking about it also because personally I believe Gravity's Rainbow's reflections on science are among its most easy to read and to interpret, and the most perceivable, the least hidden at least. And there was a beautiful passage, a couple of beautiful passages on that front here. One of them is on page 284-85 of my edition. If any of the young engineers saw correspondence between the deep conservatism of feedback, this scientific scientific idea, and the kinds of lives they were coming to lead in the very process of embracing it, it got lost or disguised. This idea that scientists fail to perceive the deep parallels between their scientific ideas their scientific theories, and life and the actual world outside their theories. Once more, this is a crucial reflection in science fiction. It's that same old reflections on, you know, when science starts losing the point, start focusing on itself, inevitably it generates monsters. Frankenstein is the case in point, which ties in beautifully with another reflection, another passage I adored from page 297 in my edition. Chemistry is being discussed, in particular aromatic polymers developed in Germany, whose key properties, the properties of these polymers that scientists are aiming for, are strength, stability and whiteness. And the text goes, Kraft, Standfestigkeit, Weisse. How often these were taken for Nazi graffiti, and indeed how indistinguishable they commonly were on the rain-brightened walls. This idea that science, this type of science, this striving toward these perfect chemical elements, has something to do with Nazis' ideal of purity, racial purity, of strength. Once again, it makes you wonder whether there isn't a political, an inevitably political dimension to science that scientists themselves very often end up ignoring, or at least end up underestimating. Many of you guys, a few of you guys actually, have asked what exactly makes Gravity's Rainbow postmodern, what are the things, the elements that makes it one of the key texts in so-called high postmodernism, and I'd like to talk about that in a later video. This one I fear is getting a little bit too long, and anyway it's a complex topic, but definitely one of the key elements in this is the fact that in postmodern thought, one of the key ideas that has nowadays seeped into cultural conscience, into the broader cultural conscience, is the idea that everything is political. That whatever you do in your everyday life, whatever choice you make, whatever you do, the things you eat, the things you wear, inevitably are political statements. Even if you don't believe they are, they actually are. And here, these types of reflections, this idea that scientific pursuit can never be pure, you can never research science for the sake of it, but it's always inextricably bound to political choices, whether you're aware or not. That's a key element in postmodern thought, and it's one of the key reflections in Gravity's Rainbow, and more broadly speaking in Pynchon, I think. It's a kind of reflection that's carried on beautifully in Against the Day, with its reflections on alchemy and on chemistry. I think this is pretty much it for this part. Loved it. Very curious about the next bit, the next 2 weeks. I think there's an equal chance that I'm going to love them. I'm going to have a hell of a difficult time. Let me know about your experience with part 2, Au Pair, Casino, Hermann Göring, of Gravity's Rainbow. Did you like it? Did you hate it? What elements did you pick up? What reflections interested you particularly? All sorts of information are in the description box. The question I'm going to leave you with this week is a question a few commenters have asked, and once again has to do with that guy Slothrop. Do you think Slothrop is a good guy? He's a positive character? Or is he a bit of an asshole? Because of course part 2 is also the part where some of the novel's most hideous characters, most notably Pointsmen, finally appear and finally are revealed in all of their actual hideousness, in all of their terrible evil nature. What do you think about Slothrop? Is he a good protagonist? Is he an ambivalent figure? My quick answer is, yeah, he's a good guy, but I still have my doubts about him, and we'll see later into the novel, and we'll see what you think. Thank you as always for watching, guys. I will see you in a next video. I'll be talking about the next section in 2 weeks' time, and bye, guys.